All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is Dmitry Balkovsky of the Reactionary Vlog, and let me introduce to you Frank Karsten of Netherlands. And today we will talk about democracy, because Mr. Karsten is an expert on democracy, its discontents, and as you can see probably on your screen too, the portrait of Mrs. there right in the corner. So a good true blue libertarian. Mr. Karsten, please tell us about yourself and why democracy is bad.
I'm founder of I live in the Netherlands, and I'm founder of the More Freedom Foundation sometime in 2002. And after that, in 2012, I founded the Mises Institute Netherlands. I co-founded it. And in 2011, I wrote a book, Beyond Democracy, which is available also in Russian and freely available on the internet, by the way. Beyond Democracy, which explains why democracy both is morally wrong and practically wrong. I thought it's a great book. I think that's the reason I wrote it, together with Karl Beckman. I recently wrote the discrimination myth, which is also available in English. You can find it on discriminationmyth.com. But of course, the topic of our conversation will be democracy. Yeah, why is it a bad system? Well, I always thought that it was a great system. That's what the politicians tell us, and the media, and the educational system. And our parents tell us that we own our liberty and our prosperity and our tolerance and peace to democracy. And I always believed that. Although it was more like a mantra. It was never explained why that was. Then, within libertarian circles, I read more and more on what's wrong with democracy. As you can see in many democracies, many voters or citizens are very disgruntled or frustrated or disillusioned with the democratic outcomes. But they generally do not suspect that the problem is democracy itself. They say, well, maybe we should vote for different rulers, or maybe our system of democracy should be slightly different, more like Switzerland, or more like the United States, or the UK system. But the general thing, democracy is never challenged in a way. It's never questioned. And because I read the book by Hans Hermann Hoppe, and I read other stuff on LouRockwell.com and Mises regarding democracy, it sounded so true. I think it's not liberty, it's the opposite of it. It's pretty much the opposite of what everybody tells us it is. It doesn't promote or foster prosperity, it doesn't foster tolerance. It doesn't bring liberty. It's exactly the opposite. And I found it so remarkable that I used to believe in this system. And the reason I wrote it together with Karel is that there was not, to my knowledge, an accessible book, a short accessible book, very structured. It's structured around 13 myths that we generally cherish. So I thought, well, let's write this. And luckily, Karel helped me. So it's a collectivist system. You're not free when the majority tells you what to do. And we tend to think that. In a democracy, the individual is subordinate to the wishes of the collective. No money, property, or liberty is safe from government meddling in a democracy. There's no limit to what the majority or the state can tell you what to do. They can spy on you, they can raise taxes, they can break election promises, they start foreign wars under false pretenses. There's no limit. The thing is that what we can see in the Western democracies, and also in the United States and Western Europe, which originate mostly around 100 years back with full suffrage, that they suffer from the same thing that other collectivist systems suffer from, like socialism. It's like we have a lot of the bureaucracy, the regulatory burden in the United States 200 times higher than it was 100 years ago. We have runaway government spending, we have economic stagnation in the EU between 2007 and 2017. Economic growth was flat. We have loss of liberty, more and more regulation. We see more and more, especially also in the United States with Trump and the Democrats, that there's an enormous polarization. And what we explain in the book is that democracy inadvertently leads to social conflict, because the winner takes all. It's a one-size-fits-all system. Of course, if we would vote for our bread from the bakery in a democratic fashion, if you would prefer different bread as I do, then you would become my enemy. Whereas now you just take your bread, I take mine, and we're peacefully coexisting. Yeah, we don't rule ourselves in a democracy. That's what we think. And because there's no us, there's no people that have the same ideals or the same visions for how to go about with the country. We have very opposing objectives, and generally we can see in a democracy that everybody tries to live at the expense of others. And they say they want to try to put their personal goals on the collective tab. It's like going out for dinner with 100 people, and maybe many of your listeners and maybe you too will have experienced this, that if you have a collective tab, you say, okay, well, this dessert that might cost $10, but if I take it, it will only cost me 10 cents. And the rest, the rest is so, and that also explains for the runaway government spending. So people are not stupid necessarily, but as consumers, they're generally quite sensible. But as voters, they're quite stupid, and that's because of that dynamic. In democracy, you're free to choose your own dictator generally, and the dictator cannot be held accountable. If the dictator or the rulers, the democratic rulers, they break election promises and they start printing money, and they can say, well, you don't have a guarantee or something, and they never go to jail. They're not even punished. There will always be a library named after them.
A library named after them. Yes.
Yes. The George Bush Iraq invasion library. No, they cannot be held accountable, and that's the only thing you can do in a democracy. What they say is, well, if you're very disgruntled, then you can vote for another party, but the other parties are just as corruptible generally. So a bad system indeed.
How did it come to be? This famous Churchill's quote about democracy being the best of the worst, so he was wrong. See, for a Russian ear, democracy is not as sacred as for a Western ear, I suppose. It is really quite striking, because I read Hans Hermann Hoppe's book about 14 years ago, I think it was in 2005, and it was the last straw that killed my faith in democracy. I was always a monarchist, to be honest. So democracy and free markets, do they live in harmony, or is there some kind of a contradiction between them? And democracy and private property, are they friends or foes?
Oh, they're certainly foes, and you can see that in the Western world. But let me first get back to what you said about Winston Churchill.
Yes.
Many people say to this, but you remember, think of what Churchill said, and they offer it to me as if it were an argument, and it is not. It's just a statement. He could have said the best refrigerators are blue or something, and so it doesn't give you an argument why democracy really is good. And the thing is, what people don't realize is that if democracy would be such a good way to collectively decide, why don't we use it in business, in families, in sports, in science? We don't do that. We don't do that either when we do our groceries.
It's an excellent argument, actually. Yes.
If we would have had it in science, we would probably still think that the sun revolves around the earth and stuff like that. And if you would use it in families, parents wouldn't dare to take more than one child, or maybe not even one. That is very obvious. We because of this thing that, okay, it's bad, democracy, people tend to accept all the negative outcomes of it, and that's a bad thing. They do not question. They say, so they're being kept in this idea that they should vote, and if they continue to be politically active, then things will change, and I don't think it will change. The other thing is that are private property or the free market and democracy friends or foes? Well, I think they're foes, and you can see that very clearly. The reason why we still think that democracy is doing well and it's fostering prosperity is that we have science and technology. That's the gas pedal, and democracy is a giant redistribution machine, and not necessarily from the rich to the poor, as we could have seen with the bailouts of the banks and stuff, but also always from the productive to the non-productive, from the responsible to the irresponsible, and from the hardworking to the lazy. Could have seen that this is in the last 200 years, the regulatory burden, like I said, has been increased 200-fold, which is clearly not in favor of free markets.
In the United States, right?
Yeah, in the United States. In Europe, I don't know the numbers there, but it's probably even worse because we are more socialist in many ways than the United States. If you look at tax burden, it used to be with the advent of democracy, like 100 years back, it was like 12% on average in the Western world. And well, it's more like 50%, and that is obvious. Why? Because if you listen to politicians, they say, okay, we understand there's a problem with education and healthcare, and we found the solution. You give us more money and more power, and then we'll solve it for you. And of course, the problem is their power. The reason is, the problem is that they spend our money on what we supposedly want. It has been calculated I think by the George Mason University, that we would be 4 times more prosperous in the United States if regulation had stopped growing in 1949. So this is like a silent killer of prosperity, regulation. We generally think that the taxes are the only one, but regulation is another one. We find it difficult to calculate that. Democracy is an enemy to liberty, and we see that more and more. I mean, they spy on us, they micromanage our lives.
But it's for our own good, you know.
Yes. Maybe for you, Dimitri, but not for me. Please, Well, that's what they say, and
you
unfortunately,
probably just don't understand what's good for you. That's why.
Yes. I'm almost convinced by your argument. This is really bad, and I hope the system will break. But I don't know. It took the Soviet Union, which was far more collectivist than Western Europe. It took 70 years for it to collapse. I hope the EU will collapse quicker than that. But
I was going to say that at the end of the Soviet Union, I remember I was finishing high school in '91, and I distinctly remember how they said that liberal democracy is the key to liberty, prosperity, and Jeffrey Sachs was there. So they lied to us, the bastards. Imagine that. What a disappointment. So
yes. Well, I don't think they lied to you, but they were just mistaken, I think people honestly sincerely believe in democracy, but they never have questioned it. They never read books like Hans Hermann Hoppe or our book by Karl and me. So they don't know the counter arguments, and they're quite generally shocked. I mean, when I talk to people, they never say, "Oh, you were wrong in your book. Your arguments don't." They say, "Well, they have to." Actually, they say, we don't know an alternative. Generally, the alternative is staring us in the face, but we can get to that later on.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's interesting. That's because, for Russia, it's very sort of a sensitive, interesting issue, let me put it this way. So the alternative, yes, because we're like halfway between democracy. Russia is quite democratic, actually. It's not like, it's not the way they paint it, that it's a complete dictatorship and all. No, it's not really. It's like semi-authoritarian, I would say. Western libertarian community, I think they're right on the verge of accepting your thesis about democracy, but they do not yet dare to step there. They're a bit shy, I think. American gold bugs, they still, I hear, talk about elections and, Trump being elected like a panacea that he's supposed to solve everything and in a democratic way. But yeah, so.
People find it very difficult to accept because they think, well, as it stands now, democracy and elections are the only way to improve things or change things, even for libertarians in a way. Secession is very difficult to do, and most states won't allow it. There's a very exclusive club in this world, and it only has 200 members, and we call them countries. Yes. And they have the right to tax their citizens and to bully them and stuff, and they don't want to have too much competition in there. So if we could secede, democracy would be powerless. It would be a paper tiger or something, but we can't. So, and that's the system what we have in the market. And that's why the market works so well. If Samsung and Apple make horrible phones, we need only one person to start a new company. We don't need a majority as a customer of Samsung or Apple. We don't need to say, okay, what does the majority want? Do they want Samsung or iPhones? You can just decide it on your own and reward those that deliver the goods.
let us say a couple of words about fiat money regime and democracy. It would be probably Siamese twins, basically, I would imagine.
Democracies are, like I said, a giant redistribution machine, and they generally lead to a welfare state. And the welfare state needs more money and more money and more money. And they can tax us.
Promises are made, and
you have to make a lot of promises, because elections are a bit of like the contest between Santa Claus, the Tooth Fairy, and Saint Nicholas we have in the Netherlands, and Donald Trump. No, I mean,
no, I'm just kidding. I'm just
sure, and that's why I'm laughing. And no, it's the politician who promises most will win. And you can see that with Obama, you can see that with either on the left or the right, but generally on the left, because the left loves democracy, because they know that democracy leads to more redistribution. Because, of course, those who excel at something, being very inventive and entrepreneurial, they are by definition the minority. But, of course, they're not the majority in vote. So the majority is suboptimal productive, by definition. I don't blame them. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's just that you give them the vote and say, oh, let's see who's got the money, who's got the power, and let's redistribute. I think, democracies are irresponsible. In a democracy, they have a very short-term perspective as rulers, because they know, well, in 4 years, contrary to a monarch, and I'm not in favor of monarchy necessarily, but you can see the differences in incentives. You can clearly know that the democratic rulers, they have a very short-term incentive. They say, okay, après moi la déluge, and after me the floods.
Yes.
So and that ties in, I think, with the fiat money system. But maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Fiat money regime logically branches off, I believe, from democracy, because there is just a lack of accountability and lack of the principle of private property, which is, I think, I might not be the true blue libertarian, but I think the private property is the bedrock. Because it means responsibility and pricing mechanisms working. So if not democracy, don't think you'd be a Stalinist or
maybe
a Hitler, right? No, you're not. I'm sure.
Or someone
who
believes in Sharia law or something. No.
Yeah. Probably not.
No, the thing is that the alternative democracy is not necessarily something else than democracy. Democracy can work if it's really small and if you can vote with your feet. So the alternative to voting with your pencil, what we do during elections, is to vote with your feet. The alternative to democracy is not a dictator. It's to democratically decide what kind of color your car is going to be. The alternative is not, let's have a dictator, because people think that the only possible alternative, theoretical alternative to democracy would be a dictatorship. Of course, that's not. We don't, with the example of your car, you don't say, well, either someone tells me what kind of car I should buy, or the majority tells me what kind of car I should buy. And right. Everybody knows the right answer to that. Everybody decides for his own what kind of car he should buy. We should vote with our feet. And we can only do that when we have decentralization of power. So we have, for instance, you have like Hans Hermann Hoppe states, like 1,000 Liechtensteins, for instance,
right.
or 2,000. And if you don't like it somewhere, you don't have to change the system. You just go somewhere else. And since these jurisdictions are not very big, it's not like I would need to go to an area. If I want to leave the Netherlands, I would have to say goodbye to my family. I would have to go to another culture. I would have to speak another language. This is all very unfortunate and not very appealing to many. So if I could just say, well, I live in Amsterdam, I go to a small place outside of Amsterdam, and my taxes will be halved, that would be fantastic. There would be competition. Right. So by decentralizing, we submit our rulers to the discipline of the market for governmental services. And I think that is the real answer. And whether that's a dictatorship, because if you go to a bakery, you actually go to a dictator because you cannot vote. But since, he's almost powerless because, you don't have to go there. If we would say, well, yes, I raise my prices, there's far more regulation when you want to buy something, then you say, okay, I go somewhere else. Or in the extreme case, you can say, okay, I bake my bread at home. So there's a lot of competition, and competition keeps everyone in check and as moral as possible. Suppose we have 7 billion people in this world. Suppose there would be 2 billion democracies in this world, like 3 or 4 people each democracy or something. And then, the majority could not force their ideas on the minority because they would just say, okay, I go to somewhere else. So in that regard, competition is the way to go.
How do we get there peacefully from the existing regime? Here quite often read on, in libertarian publications that we need to have Douglas Casey calls it philae, I think, in Greek, like groups of people with similar interests, basically. So that would be something similar to what you say. But how do we get there? That's a question.
Well, if you don't secede at once, try again. No, secession would be great. Of course, our rulers don't want to give up their power just because we want them. Of course, they are in a different business. They want more power. And this is a very universal and human incentive, mostly. And of course, since we believe in their nonsense, we don't seem to counter that. That's very unfortunate. We have to change a lot of minds that competition is the way to go for better governmental services. Because nowadays, prices are rising, quality is declining regarding the services our governments provide to us. I think first to spread the idea, and the other thing is to try to secede. This is very difficult, of course. And of course, a Brexit is already really unwelcome to the European rulers.
That's a disaster.
Yeah, suppose you would be able to secede like a Liechtenstein. Liechtenstein is the most prosperous country in the world. It's a democracy. It's a direct democracy, although it has some
monarch.
Yeah, it has a monarch or a prince that has some powers, has veto powers. It can disband the government. But of course, it's so small that you would be foolish to secede, I think. Taxes are very low. People are very pleased. It's very difficult to become a Liechtensteiner, unfortunately. But I understand that very well. I mean, they want to remain exclusive and don't get all those social democrats in. Yeah, it's a difficult thing. I don't know how to change it. Maybe I'm not that optimistic about the future.
You would be completely against the return to more traditional models, maybe, because I have this bomb to throw in. In 1897, during the Tsarist regime, that accursed regime was very terrible, very, very, very bad. The leftists say that it was very bad. In reality, it wasn't. It was very benign, and you could travel from Vladivostok to Dublin with a bag of gold coins, a loaded revolver, cocaine, and with no passport. So it wasn't that horrible. They had a census in the Russian Empire, and the Tsar and the Tsarina, under occupation, they wrote the master and mistress of Russian lands. And to be honest, I love this formulation, because if I'm a master of my shoes, I take care of them, I clean them, I try not to step into dirt. So I wouldn't really mind having a master in this respect, under one condition: if he gives me guarantees of my rights and private property. That's very important. So how is monarchy is looked down upon among Western libertarians? Is it?
I don't know, really. I didn't do a poll or something. But Hans Hermann Hoppe explains that the dynamics and the principles of monarchy are quite different. He has a long-term interest. He has if you have a dictator, the dictator generally has an interest until he dies for a long-term approach. But the monarch has a multi-generational approach. He wants to leave prosperous and good country to his heirs. So I can imagine that has some advantages over democracy, because the thing is, it's really bad. People in the West, they generally complain about Putin and Russia. They can say a lot of bad things about Russia. I'm not an expert at all. I know very little about Putin and the political system there. But at least they have one advantage over Western Europe and the United States. They don't have a down with us attitude. or policy. And I think in the West, we now have it down with us. We have lost our confidence. We have lost our faith in our own capabilities and abilities, in our vision, in our philosophies, in our heritage. We just say, well, we are all equal. Every culture, every religion, all peoples of the world, we're all equal. Well, maybe not. We're not that equal. They are very good and we're very bad because sometimes there was slavery 400 years ago and
Yeah. This
100 years ago.
self-regulation is
Yeah,
amazing.
self-flagellation, and this is remarkable that all the Western democracies suffer from down with us syndrome. I can hardly say anything positive about the Western world nowadays because we're so ashamed of ourselves, and we think, okay, let's allow people in from countries that are not prosperous, they don't want democracy, even counter to what the proponents of this third world immigration. Let's get people from countries where human rights are not existent. People look down on women, want to throw gays from flats. So this is a remarkable sense of self-flagellation, and I think sometimes, well, that's one of the signs that democracy is self-defeating.
Really is true. We should think more about that. In the northwest of Europe, you have so many old models of monarchy. Wilhelm of Orange, Habsburgs. They were very benign, and look at Franz Joseph, for example, or German Empire, the Second Reich. Europe was prospering. There was so much.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, that's one indication that you don't
need.
Having
babies, it was culturally rich and
certainly. For instance, we have modern architecture nowadays with ugly stuff.
Yes.
And another indication that you don't need democracy for prospering economy is the 19th century.
Yeah, exactly. In the second half, the majority of European countries were at least semi-democratic. Like Germany was a democratic country, actually. People say that it was dictatorship. The German Social Democratic Party was the most influential in Europe, and they were in Reichstag. It wasn't like under Hitler or something. It is a great contrast. I mean, if you look at Russia before 1917 and after, it is such a contrast. Same with Germany and same with Italy.
Yes.
Very sad. A couple of more specific questions just to wrap it up. What's your favorite historical period?
Of course, I don't like this period in which we suffer from self-flagellation and loss of pride in our heritage. Of course, the Netherlands was a very successful country for some time, and we did a lot of bad things too. Invaded some countries in the 17th century. I accept that. We did something we did very well, very entrepreneurial and stuff. So. But I do say, so I don't like this period where there's this cultural Marxism, this relativism, there's nihilism and materialism in that way. I'm not against consumerism or something, or maybe people should consume whatever they like and be materialistic as whatever they like. But it seems like the government is fostering that kind of behavior, which I don't like. I feel myself quite conservative socially. But this is, in a way, the best time to live regarding life expectancy, options, prosperity. If you look for a more cultural, a better time, I would maybe think, I don't know, I haven't given it much thought, but like 1920 or something. I don't know. It's just a guess, but at least we didn't suffer from this relativism that we suffer from now.
What's your? You mentioned Hans Hermann Hoppe is one of your favorite authors. We'll put the links to all of your books in the description, of course, and to all the contact details, so our viewers can read and acquaint themselves with your work, and I think it's very valuable and deserves more attention. What would be one or two books against democracy that you would recommend besides your work?
Well, unfortunately, we already mentioned the ones I would like to advise or recommend to people. There's the other book by Against Democracy by Jason Brennan, which I think isn't really against democracy. It just wants to redesign democracy. So I don't know very many other books that I would recommend, but maybe that's just because I don't know them. I hope no one is offended. But I think if you read Hans Hermann Hoppe's book and ours, then you're probably inoculated against this disease.
All right. That's good. From my Russian perch, I brought in this this little beauty. It's I don't know whether you can read it. I will give a description of it. It's Liberty or Equality by Erich Ritter von Kuhnelt-Leden. He was an Austrian nobleman, and he was a conservative libertarian and a monarchist. So he's got very good arguments against democracy too. So I wanted to introduce this. It's printed by Mises Institute. So yeah, it's our viewers can get a hold of it too. It's really nice. It's really nice. Talks about Russia as well. So and Western Europe and Southern Europe, comparing and contrasting. So, and the last thing, one thing that you would advise our viewers?
Well, if you are disillusioned with democracy, it's better not to become politically active, thinking you can change the world, unless you really like, being politically active, if you get gratification from the act itself and from the activities itself. So if you change yourself, you have a million times higher return of investment than if you want to change the world. And don't expect very much from voting either. I don't vote myself. I don't mind people voting. You neither? No.
I've voted for Putin, by the way. I'm declaring it openly, and I'm not expecting to be shot within 1 hour for that or thrown into prison. So yeah.
Very good. Well, if you want to be more free, you should try to avoid government, have a different idea on what to expect from the world and from politics. And one book that I can recommend is How I Found Freedom in an Unfree World by Harry Browne, the libertarian candidate for the presidential elections, I think sometime like 20 years back or something. He was an investor too. Have you ever heard of him? Harry Browne? Okay.
Harry Browne, no.
I think it's a great book. It really changes your mind how to find freedom in an unfree world.
Oh, excellent. I will list them all in the description. Let me thank you, Frank, for a very interesting conversation, and I hope to continue because I think your ideas are important. They're very much underappreciated right now, but they have a great future.
I hope so too. Yeah.
Yes. We should hope, and democracy is evil. So thank you for throwing light on it, and it was a very
thank you, Dimitri, for having me on the show.
Thank you.